we have looked at how a writer's cultural background can influence his writing. And today we're going to look at an example of how the social environment of a writer can affect his writing. Now, if you look at the social background of a writer, you look at things like the writer's current position in society. Let's say that writer is within your society and he's still living and he's perhaps in prison for some reason. What is his current social position and how did he get there, etc. So it can either have to do with his current position in society, or it can be the position in society when he was growing up. In other words, what were the social conditions of his childhood and of his growing up? It also has to do with socio-economic status, and of course that is closely linked to things like poverty. Was the person very poor? Did he come from a wealthy situation? Some writers come from very wealthy backgrounds, and that influences their writing. And of course, poverty also plays a very big role. A very obvious choice in terms of social background would be Charles Dickens. And Charles Dickens is a Victorian writer. And he lived from 1812 to 1870. He was born as the second of 8 children to a fairly poor family and on the southern coast of England. Now, throughout his childhood life, they had financial problems. And at a certain stage, they had to move around quite a lot. But at a certain stage, they moved to Camden Town, in a very poor part of the town. So they were really, really poverty-stricken. And his father had a lot of debt, right? And at the age of 12, his father was sent to the debtors' prison, which left poor little Charles in a position where he had to go and work. Now, children were treated like slaves. They were treated very badly at the time. And at the age of 12, he had to go and work in a blacking factory. Very long hours and under very cruel conditions. So he was part and parcel of the poor societal situations that reigned during that time. He lived a life of lonely hardship, and what he experienced as a child colored his view of the world and later became part and parcel of his writing. Here is Charles Dickens, the boy, who became Charles Dickens, the writer. Now, the writer then was, as we said, Victorian, and people from the Victorian age, many writers from the age, started to write their hearts out against this practice of child labor because it was synonymous with slavery, and they wanted to speak out and create change in society. So the topics that Victorian writers wrote about was very often of the poverty and the child labor of the time. Dickens himself, as we said, was a victim of child labor. And he, of course, experienced the debilitating effect of the situation. And in his books, then he goes on to criticize that, right? And his father's imprisonment and the effect that it had on him as a child had this great effect on him. And he was very, very adamant that he was going to write against the slavery of child labor. he looked also at the aspects of torture, not only child labor itself, but the conditions under which these children had to survive, the torture, the exploitation, that they were forced, they had no option, they were forced to work in factories and in workhouses, and he realized that poverty was the root cause. Now, he worked, as I said, Dickens himself worked in a blacking factory for 3 years. Then his father inherited some money, and they experienced some relief, and he stopped working and he went to school for 3 more years, when once again they got into a position of poverty and he had to go and work at the age of 15 again as an office boy. A typical example of how he illustrates this situation of child labor is of course Oliver Twist, that you must have heard about, who had a crusade against in this book, Oliver Twist, he has a crusade against the abuses inflicted on Victorian children. So it's about poor Oliver Twist and what he goes through in prison. Oliver, of course, is a young, innocent child, and he was very, very aware of the innocence of childhood and how that was just ruined by the society in which they lived. So he was the young and the innocent child, once again forced to cope with a gang of criminals, forced into child labor. And you get the famous scene that you might have seen or heard about of the parish child getting punished. Why? Because he asked for a little more food, a little more than the allotted bowl of thin gruel. So we see here very clearly how Dickens's societal influences had played such a big role in the novels that he wrote. And this, as I said, is the iconic book that you should perhaps read someday if you don't get it to be prescribed to you. Until next time.